Once again, we're checking in on Ukraine as there's been some substantial developments worth discussing. I don't normally discuss Ukraine that much simply because there are other channels covering daily events better than I can, and those daily events don't leave much room for me to offer any insights, or at least not much. The war has essentially been stagnant. Ukraine in 2022 managed to take a significant portion of the country, but since then the Russians have dug into their positions. Russia is currently fighting a defensive front, which honestly is their bread and butter. Troops are dug in with a vast series of trenches. Traditionally, armored vehicles are used to penetrate those trenches, but the trenches have been reinforced with an absurd number of mines. Simultaneously, the area is provided with fire support coming from artillery and the Russian Air Force. Meanwhile, Ukraine maintains its own defensive positions with mobile armored vehicles, comprehensive ISR provided by drones, and far better logistical trains. We've seen both sides attempt to break through, but ultimately both sides have experienced failure. The war has essentially crawled to a stop, with many comparisons, and rightly so, being made to World War I. However, three major developments have occurred that may start to change the strategic picture. In this video, I'll go over each of these developments in detail. At the end, I'll also shoot myself in the foot by making a prediction. The first development we'll touch on is the arrival of F-16s in the Ukraine. This is something that's been long awaited and is finally coming to fruition. The F-16s being received are the F-16As that have had the midlife update, or MLU. The MLU program took the advancements of the Block 50s that were coming off the line at the time and added additional features. These upgrades became the new production standard and were applied to a large number of existing jets in NATO's inventory. However, Alpha aircraft that have had the midlife update cut their APG-66 radars. While capable for the time, it's definitely past its prime now. Still, it's strong enough to power AIM-120Bs in an air-to-air configuration, or AIM-120Cs in a multi-role configuration. Unfortunately, it probably isn't strong enough to maximize the AIM-120C in an air-to-air configuration, where the jet can impart far better kinematic performance onto the missile. It doesn't seem to be too much of a concern, however, as so far I've only seen AIM-120Bs attached to the airframe. When it comes to the range of radar missiles, more is more and more is better. As it stands right now though, the radar and missile performance seem like a good match for each other. Neither system is really bottlenecking the other. It's a bit of a different story for the infrared side of things. So far it appears Ukrainian F-16s are equipped with AIM-9Ms. Definitely a dangerous missile, but compared to the modern variant of the AIM-9X, they leave a lot to be desired. This missile will lack the high off-bore sight seeker capabilities that can be utilized with the radar, and by a greater extent the helmet-mounted display, which they do have. So while the HMD can still cue the missile, it will be far more reliant on the pilot to give it good launch parameters, as the limited seeker field of view and the lack of maneuverability required to make those high off-bore sight shots limits its capabilities. Unfortunately, the AIM-9M is also going to be significantly more susceptible to flares as well. So from an air-to-air standpoint, it's not ideal. That said, it's far better than what Ukraine has been using up until this point. The Su-27 and MiG-29 are capable airframes, but they are extremely lacking in the avionics department. As by the time they were first being built, the Soviet Union had already fell behind the West in computational capabilities, since they failed to sufficiently adopt the transistor. The APG-66, even having been made around the same time and having similar radar dimensions to the MiG-29, and significantly worse dimensions to the Su-27, will still outperform them due to the increased processing power. This processing power enables a much lower noise floor and ground mapping, which I'll touch on in a bit. Aside from the radar, an AIM-120B is also an active missile, meaning it has its own onboard radar to search and track targets. Under ideal circumstances, the missile is guided via data link from the launching aircraft so it can take the most ideal route to intercept the target. Once close enough, it'll search and track the target with its own radar. It's preferable for the launching aircraft to track the enemy up until the last phase of the missile's flight. But if need be, it can break lock early, and the missile will search the area it assumes the enemy will be based on vectors provided by the last data link update. The earlier the lock is broken, the less likely the missile will pick up the target. But it still does allow better defensive options for the F-16 compared to the Su-27 and the MiG-29, which are still using semi-active missiles that require the lock to never be broken until impact. The F-16s also appear to be equipped with the pylon integrated dispenser system with the missile warning system installed. This is known as PIDS+. The missile warning system shouldn't be confused with a radar warning receiver, as that is a passive sensor for detecting radar emissions. Instead, the missile warning system is a passive infrared system that detects and tracks infrared-guided missiles targeting the aircraft. The F-22 has something similar called the distributed aperture system, and the F-35 expands on it by feeding the camera's view as a composite image into the pilot's helmet. Back to the PIDs plus pylons, this will enable the F-16 to carry a huge number of flares, and a way to deploy them if they need to fly down low where manpads reside. Probably still don't want to do that, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Another huge benefit the F-16 unlocks is the ability to make better use of the HARM missile. Since these F-16s are lacking the HARM targeting system, it's going to be limited in using the missile itself as an antenna. This is going to complicate things as pilots will have to have lookup tables handy. Ensuring the right lookup tables are in place, the HARM can look for radar emissions, but it's not going to be as fast as dedicated equipment. Finally, I want to touch on the ground mapping capability of the APG-66. The radar in the formerly Danish F-16s is an upgraded APG-66 with several key improvements like a new processor that allows for a lower noise floor, as mentioned earlier, as well as better Doppler sharpening when scanning the ground. The radar is essentially on par with the APG-68 introduced with the F-16C, though it hasn't kept up with newer versions of the APG-68. So right now the APG-66 is able to provide a 64:1 ground mapping resolution due to the Doppler beam sharpening. Again, on par with the APG-68. This means we can expect pretty much the same performance shown here in this old footage of the F-16C, and with the F-16C and DCS. Now, it's going to be a situational use case. You can expect decent resolution at about 30 miles or so, but anything past that is going to be muddy. This means Russian air defenses will outpace that capability, or at least they should. But we've seen time and time again S-300s and even S-400s getting absolutely dumpstered by munitions launched from HIMARS. So depending on the tactical situation, this can come in handy, especially as we get into the wet season and cloud coverage increases. So that's the F-16, or the first development. Now onto the second new development of the war, the invasion of Kursk. This has been rather difficult to track, but I think I managed to keep decent tabs on things overall. The difficulty has been from the fact that Ukraine has maintained really good OPSEC, or operational security. No one is really expecting this to happen, and did in the way that it did. So currently, Ukraine has invaded Russia at the Kursk Oblast. For those not familiar, an oblast is more or less the equivalent to a county here in the States. This is in the northeastern part of the country. Ukraine has assembled about 3,000 to 5,000 troops for the assault and have since taken over Zutza. From there, Ukraine has been pushing up 3 different roads, though not entirely committing. There have been numerous disruptive raids in the area as a result. So, it's interesting. A lot of analysts are scratching their heads at this move, and frankly so was I. A lot of people are thinking it's to disrupt supply movements to the south. Sure enough, if you look at Ukrainian-occupied territory, there is a railroad there that leads directly to Kharkiv, which has been under attack by Russian forces lately. So, it's possible, but they've done a great job repelling Russia in the area already though. Would it necessitate such drastic action? Others have contemplated it's for a propaganda win. If Ukraine could humiliate Putin, then that increases the pressure on him due to the nature of Russian domestic politics. This theory I find the least credible. Putin has been constantly embarrassed since the beginning of the war, when Ukraine repelled Russia from Kiev, hit Moscow with drones, was invaded by Wagner, was invaded again by Russian freedom fighters, Russia's navy losing to a nation that doesn't even have a navy, and so on. And so far, it's accomplished nothing. Personally, I think there's a couple things going on here. This is also the part of the video where I make a prediction. I made a video about Ukraine receiving F-16s in the past, where I assumed the ones they would receive would be bare bones, or close to that. I was right. So hopefully I can pull this off again and not make myself look like a total tool. So first off, I mentioned how the war has been mostly stagnant. Russia has been slowly, and I mean slowly, gaining ground near Donetsk. Aside from that, there's been little to no movement. Russia attempted to assault Kharkiv and failed. Ukraine attempted to assault the Donetsk region and failed. So, why continue? If the front line is already proven impenetrable, why continue to bang your head against a wall? Personally, I feel this is probably, at least in part, a shaping operation. A shaping operation towards what? Perhaps Ukraine has some desired effects in mind, but really at the end of the day, it's probably just to shake things up and see if it opens up any good opportunities. I know, that's not very 5D interdimensional chess, but considering how strong the front line in the south has been, doing literally anything to shake up the status quo is better than nothing. That's not to say they picked a random spot and went full YOLO. The area they chose had little defenses posted there. So far, Russia has not had to worry about Ukraine invading, as any weapons Ukraine have been receiving have had significant restrictions on their use by the West. Those restrictions are so weakened they're nearly gone, though not entirely. Secondly, it was difficult to fathom because Ukraine needed everything it could get to muster a counterattack and to take back more land. But as we've discussed, that hasn't been working out for either side for a long time. So if you have resources set aside for a task that you can't complete anyways, why not put them to use elsewhere? So, Ukraine has had their major engagement restrictions partially lifted, an excess of troops and equipment for a mission they can't do right now anyways, and a weak border to the north. I mean, might as well. Not only were the defenses weak, but there are some strategic assets in the area, like this granary, this meat processing plant, this concrete producer, or this extremely important and strategical pasta plant. Oh, and I suppose this nuclear power plant across the street is probably interesting. Yeah, I'm not going to condone fighting next to a nuclear power plant, but here we are. Russia is already digging trenches south of the plant, but I'm curious how far Ukraine would actually go with this. That is quite dangerous. What would cause Ukraine to target such a thing? Well, enter our third and last new development of the war, US elections. US elections are going to be wrapping up in November. Right now, we're looking at Trump.
The great George Washington, Commander-in-Chief. The Continental Army suffered a bitter winter of Valley Forge, found glory across the waters of the Delaware, and seized victory from Cornwallis of Yorktown. Our Army manned the airport. It ran the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do.
Versus Joe Biden.
The same stable genius who said the biggest problem we had in the Revolutionary War is we didn't have enough airports.
What?
Whoa. Yo.
In the world's worst rematch nobody asked for. Or at least that was the case until Joe Biden thankfully stepped down and announced his replacement is...
So the United States shares a very important relationship, which is an alliance with the Republic of North Korea.
Oh, my country is screwed. Anyways, a new leader is coming into office in November. It's entirely possible that this operation may have the end goal of either attempting to show support for Ukraine as worth it to the new leader, or worst case scenario, they have an excellent bargaining chip for any potential ceasefire, assuming both sides have any interest in that and the West loses interest in supporting Ukraine. Thank you for watching. This channel seeks to cut through sensationalist and biased reporting in order to inspire curiosity, intellectual honesty, and the next generation of aviation enthusiasts. If you liked the video, then please subscribe. Until the next video, enjoy your dance with the angels.